Fabulous. I don't know. Okay. This meeting is being recorded. Got it. You gotta send it to the Russians. I know you are.
Recording in progress.
Okay, you ready? Sweetie, I don't want to hear that one. What are you doing?
Everybody needs to mute except Bill at this point.
All right, I'm all set. Let me start off with this. Maybe a little bit of history would help everybody. Went to graduate school a long time ago, 60s and 70s. Made a decision when it came time to write a master's thesis that I would start a creation of an original political philosophy. Most people who are in fields have a niche in political science, in Congress, and the courts, or state, local government, whatever. I said, no, what I would like to do is create an original political philosophy because I believe that psychology is coming on stage and that will be the next paradigm, okay? And if I can help with that, then I would feel that that is something of a contribution. So when it came time for my master's thesis, I wrote a psychological comparison of Hamilton and Jefferson. I used psychological variables from the Authoritarian Personality. I'm sure most of you have heard of that. It's the classical work of the Frankfurt School people, T.W. Adorno, Elsa Frankel-Brunswick, Neville Sanford, all of those kinds of people who escaped Germany 1933, came to Berkeley, and with the help of the American Jewish Congress and Cal Berkeley, they wrote a classic piece that is still kind of the bedrock piece in psychology and politics. It's called The Authoritarian Personality. And it did all kinds of scaling and so forth. The principal scale was the F scale, F for fascism, and it had a number of variables in it. Need for order, need for power, suppression of impulse, introversion, extroversion, things like that. These are all affect variables, which means feeling, okay? And that was the great work. No one had written the anti-authoritarian personality. I wanted to have a full spectrum psychological theory. And so I said, the only way to do that is to see what the anti-authoritarian personality looks like. Would you just flip the authoritarian variables and say that people on the left are of the opposite side? Well, yes, but it's more complicated than that. And I won't try to overly complicate it here, but it wasn't just flipping, it was also finding that there was another set of variables, what are in the literature now called stylistic variables, dogmatism, rigidity, things of that kind. In other words, how tightly do you hang on to your ideology and so forth? I had interviews with over 1,000 people. I did my own anti-authoritarian personality scale. I ran factor analysis, which is a new tool at that time. We're talking early 70s here. And what it came out with was all of these various what are called loadings, in which certain things clumped with other things. And that led me to the anti-authoritarian personality. Fortunately, I sent it to Hans Eysenck. Some of you, I think, know that name if you're in the psychology field, Eysenck. He and his Jewish wife left Germany in the early 30s and went to Maudsley Hospital in London. And he hooked up, believe it or not, with Robert Maxwell. Does that name ring a bell? Robert Maxwell founded Pergamon Press in London with the help of his wonderful daughter, Ghislaine. who is now in prison for being a procurer for Epstein. Okay, but Isaac himself was clean, and he was the most cited psychologist in the 70s and the 80s. He liked what I did with the anti-authoritarian personality. He had one little zip in there, which he said, well, you've got a little too much Freudian twaddle. I'll never forget that term, but that's what I think criticized me for. But for the rest of it, he really liked it. And he included it in his series. If you will look at the Pergamon Press Hans Ising series, I think my number is 21 or something, but you can see the anti-authoritarian personality. I was very proud of that. It probably got me my first job. And, you know, I said, okay, here we go. But remember, affective variables, feeling. And I said, in order to do this right, you have to have all of the relevant psychological variables, and most particularly cognition, how people think, okay? And this, of course, had been what had come out in the kind of post-Freudian period, all right? Particularly introversion, extroversion, that sort of thing. Isaac converted these scales into 64 different languages. I couldn't believe it. And went all around the world testing, and they found the same variables in all these different populations. Well, okay. Now, here's where the rubber meets the road. I said, we need to make sure that we have a subatomic relativistic breakthrough. Please remember that what we have now, things like capitalism and socialism, I haven't used those terms in 25, 30 years. They're out of date, they're wrong. You don't get where people are psychologically just by knowing that they're either socialists or capitalists or something else, okay? And I said, here's how we're going to do it. And it was the most difficult thing that I've ever done, is I took the two great intellectual schools, the rationalists and the skeptics. And I said, okay, if you look at the rationalists, who are the two great figures? Plato and Aristotle, okay? And then if you look at the skeptics, who are the great figures? Thrasymachus, okay, who said that power was all you needed to know, all right, when it came to theory. But on the other side are people like Protagoras, man is the measure of all things. Heraclitus, standing in the river. You've all read that, I'm sure, if you're well educated in psychology. Standing in the river, it's not the same river, okay? It's you're standing there, but the water that's going by is different, and that's the relativity, okay? So again, the hardest I ever worked was to start tracing those two classical schools, the rationalists who believed that there was an order to the universe and it was understandable, and the skeptics who more or less believed that there wasn't any particular order to the world, or at a minimum, we couldn't understand it. Those two schools divide. And if you come down, you will find, and this is very intricate, okay? But you find David Hume, for example, who worked off of Hume. Hume said there's a difference between mind and object, but he didn't know which was first. And someone came along and said, David, mind comes first. That's why it's the idealist theory. Classical theory is ideal, which means mind first, okay? This is before Ludwig von Feuerbach and the materialists, okay? You got me? So you come down through Hume and you get Emmanuel Kant, all right? And from the other side, okay, rationalist side, you get a very constrained anti-French, anti-Voltaire, Diderot, Condorcet, those kinds of people. Kant was a skeptic, and he married that kind of skepticism. And as I say, an awful lot of it was English, skeptical of the French philosophers who claimed you could chart everything and have a perfect society. Okay, that came together in one of the two most important philosophers since the Greeks, Emmanuel Kant. All right. On the other side, what do you have? You have someone who takes Montesquieu. Here in this country, we talk about Montesquieu and separation of powers and so on. That's of some importance, but it's really secondary. What was important about Montesquieu was his book, The Spirit of the Laws, which revived the notion of natural law, but in a relativistic manner. In other words, different cultures would have different natural laws, okay? And Montesquieu is the epistemological father of an entire discipline, anthropology. Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, people like that who understood and worked with the relativity of cultures. Okay, so it came down that the spectrum became the relativity of Kantian versus Hegelian dialectical thought. Okay, as I say, hard book to write, even harder to read. Okay, Relativism and the Natural Left, NYU Press, Washington Square, 1984. I love those people. I'm not from New York, but I learned to love New York through NYU Press. They were so good to me to publish this book. Okay. I should stop for just a second here and say a lot of the inspiration for me to do this kind of thing came from a wonderful woman by the name of Eleanor Ostrom. I don't know how many of you know her, but she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. Okay. And she not only was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics, but she stood up to the Chicago school, Milton Friedman and all those other freaks down on 59th Street who were talking about inside baseball, like marginal utility theory, theory of the firm, price theory, that kind of stuff that came out of the University of Chicago. A great lady, Elinor Ostrom, stood up to all those guys, and she won the Nobel Prize. Boy, were they furious. Almost burned down, Indiana University building. But anyway, and I give so much credit to her. She's a wonderful human being. She taught the courses in philosophy of science, which is, you're not educated if you haven't had those courses. And those courses talk to you about what knowledge is, how you know what you know, what are standards of evidence and proof, what is causation, blah, 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 blah. Okay, knowledge itself. And I learned that from one of the very finest. She was just an extraordinary person. I'll just tell you a little joke. When we were taking her course in philosophy of science, the Beatles created Eleanor Rigby, the song. And so we in the class, when she would come in the class, we would sing Eleanor Rigby, Eleanor Ostrom, and the rest. And she had, cut that out, cut that. There's a funny thing just between us, but that's how she interacted with her students. Okay, so you got the fission fusion, and that's what that was that I did. Taking, again, the rationalists, the skeptics, but their forms, their cognitive forms were different. Aristotle and Plato, Thrasymachus, and people like Heraclitus. All right, that's how you get to the fission fusion. And that's what I called it. And people liked that. That book was well received. And so there we were. All right. Now, let me just go on very briefly here because I really want other people to start talking. If you have the relativity, and if your goal is to break through, to have a subatomic understanding. So just in this group of you in this picture, there's some of you who have different scores on an F scale or these other scales, okay? There is a psychological range here, several ranges, both affective, but also cognitive. Okay, now, at one end of the relativity is something that sounds silly when you first hear it, but it's very important, and it's in Aristotle. A equals A. Wow, really? A equals A, is that all you're saying? That's it. There are no other variables. It's not A minus, it's not A plus, it's not a fraction. It's just A equals A. There are no other variables. So what kind of cognition is that? Analytic, okay? No synthetic, other kinds of variables. Then as you move toward the center of the relativity, you get something that I will never forget it when I first saw it, okay? Kant said that the equation 5 plus 7 equals 12 is a synthetic statement. Why? Because there are two variables on one side of the equal sign, and only one on the other. For Kant's mind, that difference was enough of a difference to call that equation synthetic. Then I started reading Hegel. Hegel, 5 plus 7 equals 12. It's an analytic statement. Why? Because they're all numbers. What does that tell you about Hegel's mind that's different from Kant's mind? It's that for Hegel, he needed a larger differentiation, and that was the term that he used, differentiation. How much differentiation? Hegel said you had to have a greater differentiation in order for it to be called synthetic. So that's the center. And the two greatest minds since the Greeks couldn't agree on a simple equation. And then I said, well, what would be the other end of the spectrum? You don't have anything else that's the other relativities. No one's talked about it. And I said, well, I'll suggest what I think it is. Are you ready for this? Can you see it? 5 plus blue. 5 plus blue is the purely synthetic statement at the other end of the relativity scale. Does everybody see that? All right, I even made some t-shirts of that. People liked them in my campaigns. All right, I'm going to stop now. I've got a couple of other things to say, but I really want to include other people. I want to start off with, where is he? Where has he gone? Joe, there you're in the corner. Okay.
Yeah, I was hiding.
Joe, why don't you take it for 2 or 3 minutes, even longer if you need it, but please don't take a lot because we want to share with these good folks who have come.
Oh yeah,
All right.
I'll definitely be brief. I don't really have the credentials on trying to match wits with Bill. So first I want to thank Bill for inviting me to be on here with him. I want to thank the National Party for also allowing this time to speak, and to thank everybody here in the room to spend their time listening to us speak and hopefully get some value out of all this. Really the only point I want to make, I think Bill's view with the importance of a psychological view in politics, because, I really see like a lot of the voting community having a psychological break where they sort of have a Stockholm Syndrome where they'll vote against their own interests. We see that on both sides. I was taking some notes. There's 3 states that, I have direct connections to: Ohio, Florida, and South Carolina, where I'm currently at. And all those states, they're at pivotal points where they could give away so much, power to the government. Some of them already have. South Carolina, they've, stripped, women of a lot of their healthcare rights. They're, piece by piece, they're taking apart the public education system. Florida's doing the same thing. So it's interesting to understand, like, why is that happening? And listening to Bill talk, it made me think about, like, as a parent, and like the authority that we have to give to our kids at certain stages in their life. And, really, we don't want to hold on to that authority forever. Like, we want them to get to a point where they can do the things on their own. And like, we've just taught them a lesson. And at times, as they're younger, we have to be more sort of strict and more boundaries. And as they grow, we can ease those boundaries. And for that to really happen, the child really needs faith in the parent, that the parent's going to know what to do. If the parent's an alcoholic or addicted to drugs, it's going to lose faith. I look at it the same way with, people and their politicians. They seem to be willing to give away more authority the more faith they have into those different political groups. And a lot of it's distorted. I think, with the media too, it's really manipulated people's, views on a lot of things. But, I really think it's going to take more than just candidates, more than just policies, to really fix people and to fix society in general. So that's all the time I want to waste.
All right, thank you very much, Joe. Who would like to speak next? Listen, if you want to be the moderator, please do. It looks like.
Well, yeah, we want to open up the floor to questions about how we can apply these theories to our everyday organizing. Joe's brought up the question, like, how do we influence voters if it's not just by putting a theory out there or telling people what we stand for? What more can we be doing? What should we be doing? That's the big question.
Greg Chilcoy has his hand up. Greg, thank you for coming.
Oh, my pleasure. I just have a real quick question. All right, so you were talking about the anti-authoritarian anti-authoritarian personality, I guess you would say. And so we have a, and this is directly a psychological question. We have only recently apparently created a new diagnosis called oppositional defiance disorder. And it seems to me that that's the sort of thing that can easily be applied to anyone who is in fact an anti-authoritarian. How do we address the fact that people who are anti-authoritarian are sometimes very assertive about being anti-authoritarian, and as a consequence wind up being called people who have oppositional defiance disorder? And because I think people feel that way about adults as well as kids. And I'm just not showing my face because I'm naked.
Well, if I understand your question, please remember that the ideological range is not linear, okay? It's curvilinear. One of the things that I found when I ran the factor analysis on the interviews that I did for my dissertation was that the share of the variance in people's ideology became more psychological and less non-psychological, objective variables, class, gender, so forth, as you moved away from the center. Okay, does that make sense? What the data show is that if you're out there, what I'm talking about being out there, there's a heavy psychological percentage in your being whoever you call yourself. All right. So hopefully that answers your question. I'm not sure that it does, but at least know that psychology is becoming more and more important, in part because I just think that it's showing itself up more and more in our politics, but also because the people who in many cases are the major movers of the back and forth between the left and right and so forth are psychologically driven. They have, if they're authoritarians, a high need for order, a high need for power, suppression of impulse. They're not introspective, et cetera, et cetera. Look at the F scale, okay? And you can see all of that kind of stuff. But that's what's going on. And what I'm saying to my fellow Greens here, and incidentally, I am 2 days away from being 82 years old, okay? August 5th, I am 82. If I can still remember my Social Security number, I will be very happy. But, I still work with this kind of stuff and I give lectures and so forth. But, what I'm interested in is looking at not just people, but also institutions. One of my other mentors was a man by the name of Victor G. Rosenblum, who was at Northwestern Law School, and he was president of the Law School Association, the American Law School Association. And he said, the most extraordinary theoretical perspective ever lent to the American Constitution, which was very kind. I'm not sure it's true, but to talk about the Constitution in its cognitive forms, I have found to be very important. And if I have a little time at the end, I can talk about that, because the cognitive forms of the original 7 articles are very different from the cognitive forms in the Bill of Rights. Okay. And I don't know if how many of you remember James McGregor Burns, Williams College, really one of the great political scientists of the second half of the 20th century. And he and I became very good friends. He was very supportive of my work. And at one point he said to me, Bill, if you really want to change the system, you better deal with James Madison. I never forgot that. And the more I studied it, I think he's right. I think he's right. All right. Any other questions, comments, criticisms, whatever? I see Christopher Van has a hand up. Yes. Go ahead, Christopher. Vanderwall. Okay, I just saw Van. Now I see Vanderwall down.
I apologize, Bill. I was writing a question regarding what you felt the importance of the last 100 years ongoing trauma research plays into your philosophical modeling. I wrote a more detailed question in the chat that might help better work it out. But more or less, due to my own histories, I have deeply been observational of complex trauma, the emerging research that has taken over 100 years basically to work out, in part because of the active suppression by governments in the research fields, going from before World War I into after World War I into World War II and subsequently to present. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate any in terms of your personality theories and the political nature of it, how that in your mind would play out, and has that influenced your research and your theories to any degree?
Yeah. Thank you, Christopher. I'm not here to sell books. In fact, this book is out of print. I think there are only about 3 or 4 copies floating around. But I finally sat down and said, look, it's time to write something about the biases within the American political system, structures and processes. And so I wrote The Bias of Temperament in American Politics, okay? Second edition, a bunch of wonderful people from Duke who put together Carolina Academic Press. It's up in Durham. And they're out of them. The book sold fairly well, and they only printed so much. They do mostly legal stuff, but Keith Seif, who's the head of it, is an old friend of mine, so he published it, second edition. And what J. David Gillespie, who is one of our Greens in South Carolina, wrote, The Necessary Theoretical Crossweave, because this is the subjective variable. It's not class, it's not ethnicity, it's not gender, it's not sexual preference, it's not those objective variables, it's the mind. And again, it's going back to the classical dialectic, all right? The classical idealist dialectic. I'll do for you what I used to do for my students. All right, you see that? The subjective is now fully back in the picture. All right, up through Hegel, from Plato to Hegel, the classical dialectic was mind first. Okay, and then who changed all that? Ludwig van Feuerbach. You know about him? One of our presidential candidates came to South Carolina and made a speech. And I asked him about Ludwig von Feuerbach, and he'd never heard of him. Ludwig von Feuerbach is the bridge between Hegel and Marx. He was a historian. His principal work was the history of the Christian church, okay? Marx stole that, the dialectical materialism. It's matter that moves history. That's what Marx said. And the Marxists are still holding on to that. You know, there's no question that the objective world, the material world is very important. And please don't walk away from this saying that I've minimized that. But it has to be perceived. And what are the cognitive biases of individuals, people who we might choose to vote for various offices, but also the institutions themselves, okay? The institutions themselves. And that's what I did in this book here. What are the institutional biases, and then what are the biases of temperament in the way that we practice politics in this country? Here's a trivia question for you. Every 2 years, as a political scientist, I go look at the list of senators, 100 senators. And I look at one thing in particular, which is what profession did they come from? Now, you're a smart group of people. What profession overwhelmingly dominates the United States Senate? Oh, please.
Lawyers.
Lawyers. You want to guess how many lawyers? There are 100 senators. We all know that. How many lawyers are there in this session? I looked at this about 6 months ago. You want to guess?
I'm one.
44. 44 of the 100 senators come from one profession. Now, let me tell you something. My father was a very strong-willed man, very strong-willed man. And he didn't ask me if I wanted to go to law school. He just came into my bedroom one day and said, "You're going to law school." Oh, okay. So I went to Northwestern Law School. And I persisted. I didn't like it. I knew I wasn't going to be a lawyer. There's one thing that's very clear. but I went through Northwestern Law School and graduated. I always call it a shirt tail top 10 law school, because if you look at the rankings, it's always about 10th, okay. And it's not as good as the University of Chicago. I probably couldn't have gotten into the University of Chicago, but anyway. So I went, and I want to tell you something, and I say this to the MDs as well. I'm not singling out Jill Stein, okay? To the MDs and the JDs of the world, you're not educated. What I learned at law school in 3 years was what a law degree isn't. It is not an education. It is a training. It's a trade school. And it's the same thing for the doctors. And that's why I was fortunate enough to come to an educated person, okay? He taught me what knowledge was. And I had both a PhD and a JD. I'm overeducated. And I'm 2 days from becoming utterly senile as an 82-year-old. Okay, anybody else?
So Bill, we have 2 hands up in the meeting, and we also have a question from Dan in the chat. So why don't we call on Nissan and then David, and then we'll jump back to Dan in the chat.
Okay, go ahead.
Yep.
Listen. Yeah, that's fine.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
We can hear you.
Hello.
Okay, good.
Yes, hello.
Okay,
Yes.
yes, so
Okay.
I have something I want to discuss and see, get your thoughts on. I want to get in the conversation the idea of the incentive structure. Now, I've done a lot of dealings and simulations and dealing with both social and political ideas, but also what I really found interesting is that when anybody deals with systems, systems as a structure of rules, I find we generally have different ways people approach rules. And this is obviously seen best in things like video games. And I studied game design. And one thing we do notice very, very much is that depending on the rules of a given structure, it directs how people act towards it. So, and this is where we get the incentive structures. We incentivize certain actions, and people will do this said actions. Also, you could disincentivize actions for the same thing. It's all a matter of results. So, what I noticed in dealing with building systems and games and stuff like that, one thing you come to quickly notice is 3 types of people that we normally run into. There's the casuals, which are people that just basically try to follow the game and learn the rules as they go along, but never really fully engage with the system, just on and off. And they normally develop their own mild understanding of the system and feel like they have a total understanding of the system from interacting with it for a small amount of time. Then we have the more hardcore professional people. These people really spend a lot of time engaging with the systems and the rules, learning every little intricate detail, right? And they end up learning what the most effective strategies are. And they create what we call the meta, or this is a meta game, which is a system of, of patterns that are deemed most effective and is spread and taught. If you want to be, skilled in these type of systems, you do these types of repeated patterns. Then you have the third type of people, the people that are there to like break the system and to develop their own little meta games. These are things like speedrunners or glitches or modders. I see the same thing happen in the political systems. You have those who regularly just live their life in the system, trying to understand the rules, but don't really truly understand how things work. Then you have, like you, William, has stated, you have the law type of people who are really into the laws and are really trying to understand how the system actually works and take advantage of that. And then you also have the people that exist outside the system. Well, you know, those are normally all criminals and whatever have you. So I noticed that when you change a rule inside a game, when we do updates, for example, we would do normally what we call QOL, which is quality of life. But we also do balance changes.
Well,
So a balance change will immediately change the meta and will definitely change how people interact with the game. So this I see also apply in the political sphere, where a small rule change here would also change how people engage with the system. So should we not be looking to understand what we actually want in the society and structure rules to incentivize that which what we want? That's my question.
would you please restate that question? This old timer doesn't hear as well. Could you just phrase the question quickly?
Should we not be focused on understanding what we want in the system as an output, as an outcome, and then structure our rules to incentivize that outcome?
It's a good question. My answer would be that I don't like either or questions. Okay? And I think you have to do some of both. You've got to be aware of the psychologies of the people, all right, we are replugging here. So, thank you. All right. But you also have to be aware, of the cognitive biases of various structures. And there's been a lot written about this. I mean, this is organizational theory, you know, and there's just an awful lot written about different kinds of structures tend to attract certain kinds of people. Some kinds of people are what they call border protectors. They want to carve out their jurisdiction, and you know, they want to protect that from everybody else. And then there are other people who have a more holistic view. And some of that has to do, again, with the individuals, but some of it also has to do with the structures themselves. And one of the things that I have been very concerned about is that the American system is failing. And I ran for the Senate. Against Fritz Hollings in 1980. And I was featured in the TRB column of the New Republic, which was the principal political article of its day in 1980. And Dick Strout, who was the dean of political journalists in this country, wrote about me there. He also wrote about me in the Christian Science Monitor. And I said, the system is beginning to break down. The system is going into gridlock. And I said that 40 years ago. And I was one of the founders of a group called CCS, the Committee on the Constitutional System. It had Lloyd Cutler. You know who Lloyd Cutler was? Lloyd Cutler was counsel to the president under Jimmy Carter. For a short time, he was counsel to the president under Bill Clinton. He was also my father's lawyer. All right. Doug Dillon. How many of you know Doug Dillon? You remember that name? In both the Eisenhower and the Kennedy cabinets, et cetera, et cetera. There were good people. Bill Fulbright was in that group, and so forth. And guess what? We met because what I called for in that original article was to have a commission that at the 200th anniversary of the Constitution, we present the president and the Congress with our diagnosis, but also our recommendations for change. front page New York Times, front page Washington Post, all over America. What was the response of the Republican and Democratic parties to the recommendations of the Committee on the Constitutional System? That's right, utter silence. And they would not pay attention to us, even though we had some of the most prominent people in this country who were part of that group. And we made very specific recommendations for how to change things, including campaign finance reform. Okay, we talked about it and presented it on the front page of the New York Times in 1987. Okay, but the Republicans and Democrats, you know, it's one of the major reasons that I'm agreeing. Okay.
Okay. So a
Thank you.
follow up.
Thank you for your question. I see David Whiteman has his hand up. Can I ask David to ask his question or insult me or whatever he wants to do? David, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, Bill.
Hi.
I was just wondering, and there was a question in the chat about the same thing, but if you wanted to just, I know it's a big question, but if you wanted to talk about how your ideas relate to the current Green Party and, you know, some of the different advocates within the party, you know, advocating for eco-socialism or deep
Okay.
ecology or, you know, different strains of thought within the party itself. Do you have insights into that?
Thank you. I'm going to confess something here that I don't talk about all the time. I've never believed in all 10 values. I believe very strongly in 9 of them. But when I joined the Green Party, I was interviewed by the Illinois Greens for 3 hours because I did not agree with the notion of decentralization. Decentralization came from the Jeffersonians. They were the nullifiers, Hayne and McDuffie, whose embossed visages are still on the front wall of the South Carolina State House. I was up in the balcony a few weeks ago when we had the 6-week law that was passed by the lovely men and women of the South Carolina legislature. And my eyes were kind of wandering around the wall, and I saw this wonderful portrait of this man in a gray uniform with a white beard and a gray military hat. And I turned to my wife, who's from South Carolina. I said, is that who I think it is? And she said, yes. Robert E. Lee hangs in the House of Representatives of the state of South Carolina. All right. But also theoretically, Reid Hagel, you will never get to the synthetic cognition through overly decentralized institutions. It's simply wrong. Okay. And it's always been the other side that's wanted the decentralization. They want a weak public sector, and they got it. Okay. That's why we are where we are. That's how the corporations took over. We gave it to them with a wholly decentralized structure. And that's what James and Ricker Burns was talking about. That's what I talked about. It's what Dick Strout talked about in the TRB column of the New Republic, and so forth. You continue to have these decentralized institutions, you're never gonna beat the corporations. Sorry. The other 9 values, wonderful. I am a full-fledged 90% green. Okay. Anybody else?
I believe Dan's question was in the chat, and then Nissan still has a hand up. Could we ask Dan if he wanted to elaborate anything, and then go back to Nissan and then Holly?
I see Holly here. You want to go to Holly?
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to give Dan a chance in case we didn't quite get to Dan's question. Dan, did you want to touch back on anything you asked in the chat, or should we jump over to Holly and back to Nissan?
I'm at work. Just read out my chat.
Okay, great. Yeah, great. So I think David did touch a bit on what Dan wrote in the chat there. But Dan's chat question was, how do we organize along psychological lines? Can we identify voters based on bias, and does that work?
Can I ask Holly?
And then, yeah, of course, let's ask Holly to unmute and share your question too.
Holly, what's on your mind?
My question, I don't know how I'm going to articulate this particularly well, so you might want to go back to what Dan or Don asked. You just mentioned public sector and what I would say private sector. Going back half a century, you had what today would appear to be a more robust public sector, but how do you differentiate or how do you mitigate the same tendencies that show up both in highly decentralized and perhaps inefficient and private, what I would say privatized or corporatized, I guess government services or public services or corporatized control, which used to have quite a bit of regulation placed on it, versus the inherent tendencies toward a centralized structure, which may provide public services, but coming from a particular, and you're from a state that may have similar issues where you see resources being directed out of your area toward more populated areas. Can you comment? I hope that's clear enough if you want to comment on that, but you go ahead and go back to Don first, and because he was there ahead of me.
All right, thank you, Holly. Good to hear from you. Let me answer your question by highlighting the two principal recommendations that the Committee on the Constitutional System gave to the President, the Congress, and the public. The first is to have the House of Representatives moved up to a 4-year term, and that term be concurrent with the presidential term. Cutler wrote an article for Foreign Affairs to elect a government. So you'd be voting for a president, but you'd be voting for the House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate. You still have separate institutions. You still have, checks and balances, but there would be some sense that the public has spoken. The vox populi has spoken in some direction and given you a majority within the House of Representatives with the President of the United States. The other, and this is, now that idea is an old idea. I mean, that goes back to Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson. I mean, we didn't create that idea. The second idea is to permit at least some members of the Congress to serve in the presidential cabinet. Okay, not all. Okay, probably only a minority, but let there be some intermingling. Okay, and I still believe in that. I still believe if you had some members of the Congress that were in the cabinet of the presidency, you'd have a government that would work better. Let's face it, I don't know that I'm a genius, but I think I saw things that other people didn't see. And Dick Strout was very good to me. He was the principal senior political writer of that day. And he said, "You're right, Professor. The system is breaking down." And it has broken down. And I believe in all the good green stuff. Again, the other 9, I'm 100% on board. But you can't get synthetic cognitive form with decentralized structures. Somebody asked me, can you define your political philosophy in one sentence? And I said, sure. So here it is. If you have your pen and paper, here is my 1 sentence definition for my political philosophy. It is a psychological reading of the synthetic cognitive form as it exists in the, quotes, idea of cognition, close quote, chapter in Hegel's Science of Logic. If you will go back and read Hegel's Science of Logic, and even if you only read that one chapter, the idea of cognition chapter in Hegel's Science of Logic, you'll see this discussion of the 5 + 7 = 12 and all this other stuff, and what cognitive forms there are and so forth. Hegel believed in a strong dialectic. Hegel believed in a dialectic that all three stages of the dialectic, the in itself, the for itself, and the in and for itself, that all three of those stages were synthetic in their form. I tend not to agree with that. I think only the middle stage, which is the contradictory stage. The world goes along, apple, 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 apple. That's the reigning paradigm. And then it meets with a contradiction. See the orange? And that is the second stage. The thing known for itself, the contradiction of the old with the new paradigm. And then there is a reconciliation. Some people call it thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which is okay. I mean, there's nothing terribly wrong with it. I don't think it's as strong as saying, what are the synthetic forms of the three stages? And my position is that the center stage, the contradictory stage, is the synthetic stage. It's where the apple and the orange are fighting it out in the arena of public understanding. Okay? But some people who are really pure Hegelians, and I'm a pretty strong Hegelian, but who really pure Hegelians say, well, the whole dialectic is synthetic cognitively. Okay, I'll take your pick, either me or Hegel. I won't be insulted if you choose Hegel. Anybody else? Okay. Now, I'm going to sum up something here. And here's what I'm going to sum up with the help of my wife. The family that lived directly behind me. Oh, I'm sorry, Tanner, did you have something?
Yeah, I think I can formulate this question. And I do want to preface it by saying I agree with you that like there should be a public, and the fully decentralized position seems untenable. But given that the research that you've done and has been supported by psychology, that there is such a thing as a authoritarian mind that's attracted to power and will use violence in order to keep power. I guess the question, like, it seems reasonable to be that people would want a decentralized system, given that that personality type is going to be the one that's mostly attracted to power and centralization. So I guess the real question is how the Green Party, or how we create a movement that can actually supersede that psychological, like that type's predilection to obtaining power and holding it.
Well, Tanner, you and I'm sure have similar philosophical perspectives. The hard fact is that the Green Party's most successful country has been Germany. And the Germans, one of my great grandfathers was an old German, Kuka Kirka Kinder, right? They believe in the public sector, sometimes a little too much, but they believe in the public sector. They believe in the commons, okay? And we really don't in this country. We're a hyper-individualistic country, and that's part of the culture. And it's reinforced by the Wild West, but even before the Wild West, we were a hyper-individualistic country. And even though I'm quite liberal in my politics, but when it comes to structure, and this some people don't understand this, when it comes to structure, I'm a Hamiltonian, not a Jeffersonian. Hamilton, George Washington, John Adams, and legal figures like John Marshall, Joseph Story, they believed in a strong government. That went through John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln, and when the Republican Party was still a sane party, Wendell Willkie. My mother was pretty liberal, but boy, she liked Wendell Willkie. I think she thought he was kind of cute, but he liked Willkie, and up through Nelson Rockefeller. But after that, it went over the cliff. Okay, and it's never been the same. But anyway, thank you for that. Now I'm going to tell you a little story because we've got about.
Can I get a quick follow-up?
Neeson wants to do a quick follow-up. Is that okay, Bill? Quick follow-up question. Yeah, let's make it really quick. Neeson, go ahead.
Yeah, let me tell you a little story. I lived, when I grew up, right behind a family, and the man's name was Francis Barry Byrne. Any of you know of him? He was one of the founders of the Prairie School of Architecture. And he was one of the principal proteges of Frank Lloyd Wright, who probably was America's greatest architect. And I learned a lot from that man because I grew up with his son. And what he would do was tear off big sheets of paper and give his son and I and me a protractor, a compass, a ruler, and so forth. And we would design things. And he was such a sweet little Irishman, small bone, very soft spoken, not the least bit authoritarian. He would come over and say, "Oh, that's very nice," and so on. I'm sure it was terrible, but he was very sweet about it. But I had this great affection for architecture, and of course, Chicago is the one city that is the equal of New York when it comes to architecture, because we have some of the very best architecture in the country right here. Okay, but anyway, long story short, I became very fond of architecture. And so over time, I began to, read some books and so forth and so forth. But here's what happened. I decided that I wanted to design a building like no other. Okay, and I'm going to ask my wife to help out with this, because at one point I was invited to be a visiting professor at the University of Peking, Beijing Daxue. Okay, Wu Lao Shu. Okay, I am a professor, Beijing Daxue. All right. And what I saw there was the main gate, the West Gate. Okay, you want to show that? There it is. There is the main gate, what they call Si Min. There's a sound that's between SH and S. Si Min. The West Gate, the main gate. Okay. So that was, this just blew me away when I saw it. All right. And you had to have your pass, but you could get in here. Okay. So that was one of the things that just overwhelmed me. And then I was reading through some books and I saw the Maison Carrée. The Maison Carrée is the Roman temple built in southern Gaul that is in the best shape. The Romans built several of these, but the Maison Carrée is 2,000 years old. To look at it, it looks like it was built yesterday. When Thomas Jefferson was the ambassador to France, he knew about Maison Carré, because he studied architecture. He said, I have to go down and look at this. So he went down there. It's in Nimes, France, near Arles, near Avignon, southern France. And he took drawings of it, made drawings. And when he got back home, what did he do with it? Does anybody recognize this? Well, if you've been to Richmond and you've looked at the Capitol building of the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, I guess I should say, all right? It's not an exact knockoff. Jefferson cheated a little bit. He used the Ionic capitals instead of the Corinthian, okay? And he also didn't use 3 layers. He just used 2. But still, it's basically based on the Maison Carré. So after coming back from China, and I was a visiting professor at the University of Peking in 1994, and again in 1997. And I used to visit the Baiyuan, which is the global center of the Taoist faith, and I am a practicing Taoist. You can say, can you show this to people? No, I guess not. All right, but anyway, I have my Taoist ring here. But, well, that's next. Okay, okay. And I said, I'm going to build a building like no other on the planet. It's a building based on the Asian yin yang. All right. And I took it to an architect, many iterations, and I designed the yin yang building, which is now being constructed just off the Ohio River in an area known as the Four Rivers, where Tennessee and the Cumberland come up, the Ohio comes from the east, and the Mississippi River, of course, goes straight south. And I purchased 2 pieces of property, and I've hired a contractor, and et cetera, et cetera. And for a mere $500,000, I'm going to build, it's already started, the Yin Yang building in Metropolis, Illinois. It's just downriver from Paducah, Kentucky, okay? And I used to live in Noel Neal's house. You know who Noel Neal was? Lois Lane, okay? Because Metropolis is where Superman is, and the statue and the museum and all that. And I used to live, because she lived there for a while when she was aged, and a relative had died off, and her agent brought her up to Metropolis, 308 East Park Street. But anyway, so that building is being built, and it's dedicated to peace. It's the complementarity of opposites. What the Taoists do. Again, you can't see this, I'm afraid. But just, put your fingers like this. All right.
Okay, let me give everyone a 5-minute heads up. And I noticed that Christopher and a few others are chatting about continuing this conversation over in Discord. So I don't know if Christopher wants to come on or post anything more in the chat about how people can join that if they want to continue the conversation.
Yeah, my email address is billkreml, BILLKREML, @gmail.com. Okay, couldn't be simpler. So anybody who wants to be in touch with me, I'd be glad to respond. And I still have a couple of copies of the relativism and the natural left and the bias of temperament. I think we're getting to the point here. And one other thing that I wanted to say, okay, can we do this? Because there was a second Eleanor who had a great impact on me. Go ahead, hit it. Who was that? You recognize that? Who is that? Nobody knows who that is?
It's Eleanor Rigby.
It's Eleanor Roosevelt. That's right. I was born in 41. She didn't die till 1962. My parents adored her, and I was raised with her. Okay. And let me show you something. Okay, my wife's going to show you this. Where was she significant? She and 8 other people were the principal drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 22, and the free development of his personality. You see that? This is in 1946, and she wrote this. Okay, yeah, go on to 26, I think. Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and so forth. And then Article 29. Everyone has duties to the community which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible. Excuse the sexism, of course, but 3 times in the latter articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have discussion of the development of personality, psychology. Okay, she was an extraordinary woman. I mean, it's interesting that 2 of the most influential people in my life were named, spelled differently. Eleanor Ostrom was Elinor. Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, Eleanor. Thank you all. I love you for coming. You've been wonderful. Rita.
Thank you, Bill.
I haven't heard from you. I heard that you moved to Wisconsin. Is that true? Okay.
Well, I want to say thank you to Bill and Joe for being here for our workshop. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Thank you for being a moderator. You were wonderful. Thank you all.